Hello there, and welcome to another great edition of Ask the Expert on Contingent Workforce Strategies LinkedIn group. Okay, so this one's going to be epic. I've got the infamous Eric Osterhout on today's edition of Ask the Expert, and we're going to be talking about optimizing your supplier community. And so, you know, lots of people already know Eric, but I'll go quickly through his bio. And he's got over 15 years of experience in this industry, on and off, and started at IQN, which has now been merged with Beeline, and then worked at some of the largest programs in the industry. And so today's topic is a great one because my friend here is the master of working with supply chains, optimizing it down and then up when needed for different skill sets. So you're going to really enjoy it. Eric, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Jeff. I've been wanting to get on your show for a while here, so I'm very excited to be here, and I appreciate you calling me a friend. You and I have known each other for a very long time now, and
Well,
in fact,
we
I
actually
appreciate you
met
calling.
through the LinkedIn group. That's the
We did.
weirdest thing, right? And it wasn't a dating app. It was the LinkedIn group. We met online.
Exactly, and it was that group which really was probably spawned a lot of the uh, I'd say the thought leadership of our industry niche. I mean, there really wasn't a lot, and back then it was just so great to be able to find a place where I could share ideas with other people that were going down the paths that we were, which is managing programs. It was very refreshing to find that group, and I had a lot of fun, and we've met a lot of people, and I'm just appreciate you inviting me in today.
Awesome. Well, this topic is a hot topic these days, right? Because we're kind of nobody's talking about a recession, but we are in an economic cycle. And then, of course, so maybe business is down a little bit or different projects are going to take off. And so making sure you are optimizing your supply chain and working with your supply chain as business goes up and down is really important topic. So when I look at, like, from a high level, what are some of the objectives and the return on investment that you've seen in the different programs you've been involved with in managing your supply chain and being a lot closer to your supplier community?
Yeah, I think one of the main things is obviously the holy trinity or the objectives of any contingent labor program is that you obtain the best possible resources at the most effective price point and then deploy them as quickly as possible. That's ultimately what a contingent labor program strives to do. And in order to do that, you have to have a supplier base that is effective at being able to fill your business needs. They understand your business because you need your hiring leaders or people leaders and hiring managers to have faith that you can provide the resources they need. Otherwise, you're going to have problems with leakage going around your programs and things like that. So to me, I think the biggest return on investment of having a managed supply base is that ability to have a very efficient and well thought out supply base plan. I look at supply base as a living, breathing thing, as you mentioned. You know, what is contingent? Contingent means it's on demand, so you can scale up and you can scale down, right? Many times I get questions about, well, Eric, how many suppliers do you have and how many do you need, to do this? And I'm like, it doesn't. There's no fixed number of what that number should be. It's about conditions and being able to adapt and being able to make sure that you have enough suppliers in your program in a given skills category, for example, to be able to create effective competition. So you're getting your best rates, but you also want to balance that with not having too many suppliers, because then what happens, and having been an ex-recruiter, Jeff, and I think you were too
Yeah.
back in the day, when you had A-level candidates, top-notch candidates, you wanted to go where you could place them, right? Because we're money-driven back then, right? We still are, I guess,
Well,
to
it
an
still
extent.
is, right? So you've got to incentivize your supply chain to get those top talent from them when you need them. And so keeping them engaged either through financial rates or through relationship, you're going to try to be that client of choice, right? Is important.
Absolutely. But, making sure that it's not overly competitive, because what happens is when it's overly competitive, you lose that touch, that close touch and relationship with that supplier, and they'll take their A candidates somewhere where it's a little less competitive. For example, harmonization type situation. We had, it's no secret, my organization was purchased by a bigger organization, and we had to merge two supply bases together. When we did that, you realize you had way too many suppliers. I mean, when you had 27 suppliers in a skills distribution category, say IT, it wasn't healthy, and we weren't getting the quality we needed. So being able to manage and balance that supply base is an art and a science that I've had a lot of success with, and it pays dividends because you get better candidates, you have more engagement with your suppliers, because you can't manage hundreds of suppliers and effectively communicate with all of them through a year. So I think that's probably the key, is being sure that you have that supply base at the right level based on demand, based on skills distribution. And I know some suppliers out there will see this, and I have a reputation of being honest, transparent, and not wasting time for suppliers. But based on demand, when I have my supply base where I need it at a given point in time, yes, if you hit me with something that resonates, that could be of value in the future, I might talk to you. But otherwise, I'll be straight up and tell you I'm not adding suppliers based on the demand levels that we have today, because everything's a balance. And when you have it balanced out, things rock along, and you have that faith from your stakeholder community internally. The good thing is that, and this is the supplier good thing, is that over time, sometimes things change. So, that's where I always respond to them. It's like, hey, today, nah, ain't going to happen. Maybe in a couple of years, maybe in a year, maybe 6 months. We don't always know what the economy is going to do, right? But for the other thing that has been very effective for us in combination with managing our supply base and the ROI we're getting on that is also our direct sourcing program, which is continuing to allow for opportunities to optimize and rationalize out further, because we don't have as much of a need for external suppliers per se.
So, when you think about and go back to the experience of a merger, or when you come into a company that wasn't managed or optimized, and you've got a contract with 1,000 suppliers, which are only providing 90% of them are providing one resource or have zero resources on billing, right? What are some best practices or advice that you could give in rationalizing that? And you've kind of hit on some of the key things, because the suppliers don't want to waste their time either. But what are some of the best practices, taking the list from 1,000 and putting it down to, say, 50 to 100?
Data. Obviously, having that data, you touched on it, knowing what their head count is. You can usually get a pretty good feel for how much participation. I believe data and effective scorecarding. I will tell you, my scorecarding is very much from when I was on the other side of the desk. I want to see what a supplier receives in opportunities that's generated by our program, how many they accept, how many they actually respond to, and then as it flows downstream, how many of their candidates are shortlisted, how many are interviewed, and ultimately how many are placed. It's kind of the old branch manager mentality, right? And to me, that tells me how much a supplier is engaged in our program. It tells me how effective their teams are, and it makes it a little easier. Combine that with just overall data like headcount, attrition, things like that, you can get a pretty good idea of an existing supply base. Now, in a situation where you have 1,000 suppliers and there's so many onesies and twosies, the next thing I recommend is something, and I'm very experienced at this. I had to do this in a very short amount of time about 5 years ago. Make sure you have a hooded robe and a sickle, and that's when you start terminating agreements. I was known as the angel of death for many suppliers during the last exercise I had to do with this, and I felt bad doing it, but many suppliers, they kind of know it's coming. They know they're not engaged here anymore. The other thing I recommend is looking at your supply base. I mean, there are certain suppliers that may be in a program that they were brought in because of a specific niche that they fit.
That's what I was thinking. You have 1,000 of that, you're still going to need some of them down the road, but you just don't need them now, right? So how do you keep them engaged in your program when you need them? And you just don't hack their contract. You got to keep that engagement mechanism there, but you also want to keep them engaged to, invite them to supplier forums or different things like that, that keep them engaged, that when you do need them, they're going to be there for you.
Yeah, a couple of things on that. I mean, you touched on some great points. That's why we structure our supply base a little uniquely. I have what are called sourcing suppliers, and those are the ones that are going to play in the beauty contest and work on requisitions that are competitively distributed. Then I have what I call warehouse suppliers. And these warehouse suppliers, in fact, when you start going through your list of 1,000, you see a bunch of the onesie twosies. Many of those suppliers are very, very niche, and they don't really want to be in the beauty contest of competitive sourcing, right? They're not really traditionally staffing companies. Many of them are integrators, smaller integrators. Many of them are brought in to do specific things, but yet what they're doing, they may have been brought in originally on the services side of the house to do actual deliverables based services where there's risk on that supplier. But then what happens is when the project is done, and I don't think anybody else will ever see this but me, right? Wink, oink. But what'll happen is that managers fall in love with the workers that are on that project. And then they're like, hey, can you stay on and just kind of run support? And I've got other
Yeah,
things
on an
for you to do.
hourly basis or ad hoc, or
Bingo.
I need that person back for 3 months, right?
Right.
So
So
how do you keep them engaged, but maybe in a more manageable way? Do you run them through one of your preferred vendors that has a engagement, and then the third party warehouse suppliers don't get put into the competitive bidding process and the rates, let's say, per se, but they're still brought in when needed, but brought in through a manageable, let's say, administrative process. So your AP department and other things like that don't have to deal with it. And then your QBRs aren't with 1,000 suppliers and things like that either, right?
great question. And the way that we accomplish that is a couple of different ways to keep that supplier warm.
Yeah.
We usually take that supplier that necessarily doesn't want to play, that's warehoused, we'll either keep a direct agreement with them. Suppose their headcount's over 5. It kind of makes sense to go ahead and keep a live contingent labor agreement in place with them. But if they're onesie twosie, but strategically could be used for more at some point, we'll explore placing them under an approved supplier. In our organization's case, it's our employer of record services provider. So we use them in a vendor to vendor, or in the
Yeah,
US, we call
and
it corp to corp.
usually they have a smaller margin. Well, that's what
Right.
we used to do at CWS and People 2.0, right? We used to manage the long tail of non-preferred suppliers or one-off suppliers as well. And because we had a very small margin, it was a small tax to pay to do business, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting though is the pushback sometimes is a little bit upfront, but then when you start explaining that once you're a sub supplier, you're actually on more favorable payment terms than if you were a direct supplier, i.e., net our standards net 45, and our employer of record services provider is about 30 days from invoice received,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
once you start invoicing your time to that supplier you're underneath as a sub supplier, it becomes like clockwork. You're getting paid faster than you would if you were a direct supplier. That's
Yeah.
just one of the features of it.
Talk about some best practice in evaluating your suppliers. You mentioned KPIs. So, what are some of the key KPIs that you look at with your existing supply base? And then to monitor if they're engaged and should continue in the program or be exited out of the program. And then question 2, and I'll separate the 2 questions, evaluating new suppliers, right?
Okay.
Some practices that you've used when tasked with, hey, we really do need some new suppliers here because we're getting rid of some, or we've got a new project that has a different need in terms of the resources or supply base.
All right. Let me tackle question 1 first. They're definitely related. I talked about my performance scorecarding and how I look at it as an old branch manager. And I take into account some other statistics like attrition. We operate off of a not to exceed rate carding scenario here. So obviously market rates are always going to be a look back, and we want to be kind of close to that. But one of the big complaints in programs that run under an NTE position, under NTE type scenario, is that you sometimes have workers that are underpaid, or the appearances of being underpaid by their supplier, maximizing that. And the goal of having a not to exceed rate carding scenario with your suppliers is because, number one, we all have different, all these supplier companies have different costs to do business, training, some benefits are better than others at suppliers. So we wanted to get out of that pay bill scenario and say, all right, here's what the market says we should pay for this worker. You submit at will within that rate or close to it. You know, sometimes it goes over, depends on the budget and the manager's tolerance for going over. But what happens inevitably is you have some suppliers that have a way higher burden internally and a higher cost of doing business. And it may be because they have way better Cadillac insurance benefits in the US, for example. What happens though is at the water cooler is you get people talking and someone hears that another worker is making so much more than them and they're not being paid that, and then there's problems.
Turnover,
So
probably. Yeah.
that's where in the statistics I not only look at performance efficiency on sourcing, but I also look at attrition. When you have, I don't really want to get into a company's structures about how they pay people unless it puts risk into my supply chain, right? So if I see a pocket of attrition in a particular group, area, skill set, whatnot, and I track down the data, and this is where data is key. As I've said before, data is everything. I can see whose workers are there. And if they're having a higher level of attrition than, say, other peer suppliers, we're going to have a conversation. Oftentimes, it comes down to the fact that the supplier will say, we have way better training, we have way better insurance, blah, blah, which very much could be true. But my response to them is, look, you've got a problem in this group. You have people that are leaving. That's impacting our business continuity. I need you to settle it down, or I'm going to have to move you out of that group and take your remaining workers and go somewhere else. What it usually translates down to, and I also tell them, look, you may very well have very, very lush benefits and you may have great training programs, but your people are not understanding that. So either you
Correct.
educate them and settle down the noise, or you pay them more, one or the other.
Yeah.
But I need you to get this problem off my plate. And most of the time the suppliers get that and they'll go back and talk and settle it down, or they'll
just reduce their margin that they felt they got in the first conversation and were cheering in the background until that happens.
Right.
And it is what it is, right?
Now, the second part of your question, when you talk about new suppliers, I have a lot more patience with new suppliers that come into the program, especially with some of the work I'm doing in the DEI space, because we expect them to have a learning curve, right? And one of the things we task our MSP with is really being a buddy to them, really give them all the tips you can. We are a almost no contact program as we've matured. When we were first deployed, we were a contact program, and I think any newly deployed program has to be. But then you get to a certain level, and it's like, okay, we've got our suppliers. We have the control of the supply base. Most of these suppliers have enough familiarity with what we're doing. If they can't fill competitively and not have contact, then they probably don't need to be in the program. What's interesting is we had managers in the beginning that were like, we got to talk to our supplier because, you know, Susie and Joe, they used to bring me the best candidates. When we started going to that no contact and said, give it a try, and they started realizing that with the sanitized resumes and stuff coming across, they were actually obtaining different people from different suppliers and realizing that, wow, maybe those suppliers that were on this are better.
Job. You really have to have trust with your intermediary, who's your ambassador with the supply community and the manager community. And I know in your current circumstance, you have a very good MSP in place and handpicked people at that MSP that give you the ability to be they act almost as your own employees, and they've proven themselves as well as good screeners. So your internal managers have trusted those people so that they don't have to talk to the supply base as much, right?
Right, and that's exactly it. I mean, and we've been very blessed and we're very lucky, and we do view our MSP as a part of our category team. I mean, they really are. They're embedded very closely. We've worked with them. There's a lot of experience on that team. And you're right. We've encouraged those TSCCs or whatever you want to call the account reps that deal with that to really engage with their business stakeholders, to understand what the stakeholders really need. For example, intake. It's not just hey, what's your cost center and where are you located at? No, no, it's a, hey, let's sit down and talk about what you really need here. What are the key skills? What's the secret sauce? All right, can this worker be in Calgary or can they be in Houston or can they be virtually and remote, especially after COVID? There is some of that. We operate as a standard off of a hybrid program, but hiring leaders in our program have the opportunity that if they need a resource to be fully remote as a contractor, they can. It's their latitude. They just need their director to say, yeah, that's cool. And it also affects their team. I mean, many managers don't want to do that because they have the rest of their team coming in, and it kind of that's a whole nother call for another day.
Yeah.
But it really does assist with being able to get the right data up front. So we do have a lot more latitude with newer suppliers because we want them to be successful and we want them to partner with our MSP representatives to learn. And we've had some very good success with that model. I don't want to name any names because I want to keep this kind of independent, but you'll probably have seen in some of my posts or in some of my other stuff I've been on, there's a couple of suppliers that have done really well that way. And we've also come up, speaking of diversity, with some very unique means of being able to engage diverse suppliers. From a supply-based management perspective, I feel like it fits into this conversation.
Very much so.
Many diversity suppliers that darken your doors or your email inbox or hit your diversity teams and are forwarded to you are not necessarily the big diversity suppliers. Many of them are very tiny and they're just starting out and they have heartbreaking stories and very interesting backgrounds. And I love talking to them.
Well,
I
and
don't
often
engage.
access to a pool of talent that the big firms would never access because
Agreed.
either they're part, like in oil and gas, of course, there's First Nations and Indigenous communities that most of the staffing firms that are your tier ones typically would never be able to access because it's a very close-knit community, and having access to that is important, especially in oil and gas when you're working in remote locations like that.
Yeah, and really at the end of the day, being able to help some of these smaller suppliers, and since we're talking about supply-based management, many of these are smaller and really they can't be, they're not as sustainable to risk. For example, you upgrade a financial system or something. Invoicing and payment times lag and go past the 45-day mark, for example. It can take down a smaller supplier. They don't have the cash flow necessarily to withstand that. Or when COVID hit, it could take them down just because their business just dissolves in front of their eyes, the amount of headcount they have. So we came up with an idea that we worked on with a partner. We call it the Diversity Supplier Network. We keep it also very limited from an entry point. And we started a pilot of this in Canada, and Eastern Canada actually, and we've rolled it across Canada, and now we're rolling it to the United States. It's been a very effective way for me to be able to engage suppliers that are of diverse of a nature, but not big enough to stand and fight against the other suppliers in our supply base in a given category. So a couple of unique things that we have, even in our main suppliers that we have in tier 1 and tier 2, every requisition that goes out to at least one diversity supplier of certified of a diverse nature in Canada and the US, at least one. The Diversity Supplier Network also helps bring additional diversity to that because they actually get, when they're in the Diversity Supplier Network, these smaller suppliers that appear as one supplier in my VMS.
Yeah.
There's like 5 or 6 of them on the other side that of that equation, and they can then provide candidates, and it's been working. We submit to that group in a tier 0 capacity, right? So yes, do we give them a head start? We do, and they're starting to really do well. We look at it as an incubator too. It's another means for us to be able to get them immersed into how our business operates. And so they understand what I look for in the way of efficiency through our intermediary, which is our EOR provider. And as they grow and get more successful and headcount reaches a certain point, I can always drag them into the program and let them stand on their own.
Bring them up the tier level, let's say, as well. But you're also, you've mentioned the word incubating. You're incubating means you're having some accommodations. So like you say, cash flow, potentially not having the insurance. So you've got this layer over top of it with an EOR provider that has the insurance that meets your commercial requirements, where that would cost the small supplier too much. So some of these accommodations, you're helping them overcome that so they can do business with you. That's great. Amazing.
Yeah, it's something that then they say drinking won't solve your problems. I actually came up with that idea over a quick ad, Tito's vodka. I like Tito's vodka. Anyway, that was when that idea came up in 2019 in San Diego. Actually, it was an interesting trip, but yeah. So we're a little bit more tolerant of new suppliers that get into the program. We haven't added many new suppliers because, like I said, I've kind of got things where they are.
Yeah.
But in a couple of diversity supplier cases that we've brought on, we are more tolerant up front until they get to know it. But it's one of those things that we have a manageable number of suppliers and we keep it that way, and it flexes based on demand right now and probably for the next year, just the way you'd mentioned the economy earlier. I think we're pretty good where we're at, and like I said, our direct sourcing program is also lessening our dependence on externals. So I think the suppliers that we do have in place are satisfied, especially when they're in tier one, because there's less competition, so there's more placements, and it accomplished everything we thought it would when we started moving to that tiering scenario.
Amazing. So, Eric, this has been an amazing time we spent together, and lots of tidbits of gold in this. So I'm so excited and thankful for your time here. And I think we've already kind of identified some other Ask the Expert episodes that we're going to have to deal with in the future.
Oh, you just reach out. I'm more than willing to talk on some of this stuff. I could write a book about some of this stuff. It's crazy.
Yes, you can. Thanks again.